on mine. Anyway, never mind. Let's move on. So yes, thank you for asking me to talk about this topic, resilience, because it is actually quite dear to my heart from many angles, I guess, but not only from an academic angle, because I've been studying it for researching it for a number of years now, but also because I've got very much lived experience in the space, as does everyone. So we all have our own experience of what resilience is and what it's not. But also I think because, it's all becoming about how resilient we are to what nature throws at us, and to, being able to mitigate the effects of a changing climate. And I'm not sure how many in this group were at the last lecture a couple of weeks ago, but I'm going to try and just build on from that. You've all probably heard that we are in this period of the Anthropocene. What does that mean? It basically means that humans are actually shaping the future of the planet, and how it's going to evolve, and what it's going to look like. So, and if we do have skeptics in the room, I'm sure some of these slides might help you to question whether this climate, the massive swings in climate that we're seeing and experiencing, are either human induced or just part of evolution. So what that means when we start to talk about the period of the Anthropocene, is that we need to be very, very careful about tipping points. Now, tipping points, really, it's like when you've gone beyond being able to bring it back to where it was. And you're going to see tipping points, economic tipping points, social tipping points, when people just can't take, any more stress or any more anxiety, and they just tip. And environmental tipping points, when we start to see, loss of species and habitats and so forth. But what we need to understand in this picture, and what always has helped me when it comes to resilience, is to understand we are part of a very complex adaptive system. And it's a system that has the capacity to self-organize and constantly evolve itself in periods of uncertainty into a new form. And we need to evolve with it. And that's really what this particular presentation is about. How do we evolve with it? How do we learn not to fight against the changes that climate's going to bring, or fight against nature, but to actually evolve with it and learn how to live with this, I guess, this new form of planet. And so that's what, to me, resilience is about. Being able to, it's more than bounce back, it's being able to evolve with the new. So I particularly love this picture, in that I think this is a very resilient tree, and it's probably one of the best pictures I have to pragmatically demonstrate what resilience looks like. Now, this is a tree in my front paddock at home, and what's happened is this tree has been smashed by lightning. We get some cracker thunderstorms up at Ebor. So for those that don't know where I am, I'm actually the highest cattle property in Australia, to be exact. I'm 1,500 metres above sea level. I'm at Ebor in the Northern Tablelands, New England. And it's a pretty lively place when it comes to all things weather. But the thunderstorms are big, loud, and quite, they certainly leave a lot of devastation behind them. And they tend to run up the sides of the rivers, and they just split trees right before your eyes. And what's happened with this tree, you have a few of these, but it's split it straight down the middle, split it out sideways, and then all these suckers have come up out of the trunk of the tree, which I just think is gorgeous. And that's a perfect example of what resilience is. Now, we've all seen this. This was 2019. This is actually at our property. So, you know, they were referred to as the worst, well, it was the worst drought in living history, followed by these fires, the worst fires in living history. And then, of course, we all remember the floods that followed. And it's a couple of pictures from poor old Lismore down the bottom. And the two pictures on the top are actually the Dorrigo Mountain, which is the access to our farm. And the avalanches were incredible and really just cut off the Tablelands people from the coast for a period of months while we tried to clean up this mountain and the mess. So these are the sorts of things we're dealing with. That particular scene was the day I decided to concrete my yards. I just couldn't handle any more mud. And of course, ever since I've concreted the yards, I haven't seen any rain like that. And it was probably 80,000 I didn't need to spend, but hopefully in the future I'd prefer to have the rain back and know that I concreted the yards for a good purpose. But yeah, the cattle weren't happy, and I can tell you neither were we trying to work in that. So what we're dealing with here is, and what COP was about, is trying to get everybody's head around this stuff, trying to, you know, prevent the planet from heating up, keeping it at, you know, 1.5 to even 2 degrees is the aim in Australia, but that's looking to be harder and harder to do. And I don't want this to be a depressing lecture, because there's always positives that come out of this stuff. But we're also seeing the ramifications of what's happening in the climate through these heat waves, the floods, the droughts, and refugees from uninhabitable lands. I mean, the wars, all of this is all signs of a very unstable planet. And of course, our extinction of insects, corals, plants, and etc. So this is, hopefully this will work. Oh, use two different gadgets to make it work. Here we go. So again, this is for the skeptics. Hopefully, of course, in the mentoring program, we don't have too many, but it's good to be skeptical. It's good to ask questions, and it's good to look for evidence before, you know, you make your own decision on these things. But basically what this shows is increasing temperatures over a very long period of time. In fact, I think this is a 100-year graph, if I remember. But you can clearly see, and this week's been a classic example, that things are getting a little warmer. And so we need to now think of how we can assist not only humans, but species to remain resilient through this. More of the same. So now let's get to some pretty cool stuff. And this is, again, this is probably part of my PhD, but this is actually the Stockholm group of scientists' principles for building resilience. And I actually tested a lot of resilience models, and then I brought them back into Australian conditions just to see, well, how do these group of scientists in Europe really, you know, do they have any, is what they're saying applicable to Australia and to what's going on here in Australia? And I tested this over a longitudinal study of different groups of farmers and how they stacked up in different types of farming systems, how they stacked up against these principles in a nutshell. So we'll unpack what they mean, but you can see there's 7 principles, that magic number I love, for resilience: manage connectivity, and we'll talk about what this means, manage slow variables and feedbacks, foster complex adaptive systems thinking, encourage learning, broaden participation, promote polycentric governance systems, maintain diversity and redundancy. So what does that actually mean in a practical context? So if we look at this from a farming context, let me just move that out of my way. When we talk about maintain diversity and redundancy, we're talking about things like, you know, how many enterprises or income sources do you have on your farm? So when you get that perfect storm that we saw, for instance, in the beef industry a couple of months ago, where we had some pretty horrific dry weather, and a crash in the cattle market, you could really say our prices reduced to about a third. That's a fairly perfect storm for the cattle industry. So not having all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and having other enterprises would help you maintain diversity and redundancy. It means that if one enterprise becomes redundant for whatever reason, you've got another one to rely on. And I'm talking from an economic perspective here. That's an economic example. If we look at an environmental example of that, it might be having plenty of different species in your pasture. So the more species you have, if you get a period of very hot weather, some species won't hack hot weather. Whereas, for instance, some of our native grasses that have been used to this stuff for thousands of years, they'll hang in there. So you'll always have ground cover. And if one species of plant bowls over, then you know you've got another one that can take its place. And so that's why we really advocate in Regen World about biodiversity, and as much biodiversity as you can get, because it builds resilience of a system. And so that's giving you an economic and an environmental explanation of what maintained diversity and redundancy means. Plenty of diversity prevents redundancy. Manage connectivity. Okay, these are things like, in an environmental context, tree belts, wildlife corridors, and nature strips. These are really important because critters, animals, species need to move across landscapes, and they need to do this so that they can actually reproduce, breed, and exist. And it's the same with humans. We can't have children with our cousins. You know, we need to move across different landscapes to meet other people. So that whatever we talk about, when we talk about environment and nature, you can put exactly into a human context, because we are just another species on planet Earth. Okay, so we're part of this ecology. And so we too need to move across the corridors to meet new humans for all sorts of reasons, to share knowledge, to trade, and to reproduce. It's exactly the same thing. Manage slow variables and feedbacks. That means basically measure what is going on here, measure and monitor what is going on in the landscape, what's not looking right, what's different. And the more that you're attuned to that and looking at that, it's not, you can actually adapt your practices and you can adapt your thinking and what you're doing, because you're looking at the slow changes that are going on in your landscape. And it's that landscape's giving you the feedback that something's not right, that something needs to change. So being always monitoring your landscape is really critical. Understanding that social ecological systems are complex adaptive systems. We've talked about that. The system will continue to change. Okay. Now, we can try and fight that, but we will lose. We have to be able to change with it. So, you know, understanding that we just need to be able to adapt as best as we can, and it could look very different. And things like the time-controlled grazing management practices are very big on this. So utilising and understanding holistic management frameworks and for decision-making is quite critical. So if you haven't done that sort of training and you are looking to go into farming, or you're already in farming and haven't done it, it is critical to understand about complex adaptive systems. Encourage learning and experimentation. Well, you guys are doing that now, big tick. You're doing the mentoring program. You never stop learning. You never get to the end point. The number one reason I think that I'm in agriculture and keep gravitating back to agriculture is because no one day is ever the same. No challenge is ever has the exact same answer to try and address it. And I'm constantly being tested and challenged. So my learning will never, ever finish, and neither should anybody's learning ever finish. So you never really reach your end point is the point of that particular principle. Broaden participation. So your social and community engagement is critical. And we've all seen, for instance, boards that are full of, and with all due respect when I say this, men over the age of 65, and they're all white and they're all sitting around the board table and they all agree with each other and they're great meetings and they're over in no time and everyone's, having a drink afterwards. So there's a lack of diversity in the decision making. And now, thank God, companies are made to be held account for that sort of stuff in their decision making. They have to have diversity on their boards of age, of race, and of both male and female, if they're going to be able to solve some of their own challenges. And good decision making means lots of diversity. So when you're looking at a challenge in the paddock, what I tend to do is I have my trusted advisors and consultants, and I bring them all in. And it might be First Nation, it might be a representative from First Nations, it might be an ecologist, a microbiologist, could be a financier, an accountant. It's a whole mix of discourses will come in and look at a problem differently. And that's where you get that real rich participation and some fantastic out-of-the-box answers to some really wicked and complex problems. So broadening participation is absolutely essential. Now, promoting polycentric governance systems doesn't really apply to us in Australia. We're very lucky because that's what we have. We have a local government. And remember that just jumping back a bit, these resilience principles are not just for environmental issues. They are social environmental principles for the whole globe to follow to keep everything in balance. So when you have a governance system that relies on one dictator, and we already have that in Russia, and we can see how well that's going, you really are in a lot of strife. Luckily in Australia, we have local government, we have state government, and we have federal government. As much as those three tiers of government do our heads in at times, it is a very healthy system. And if one has problems, the other can pick up. And so we also have, regional governance as well. We used to have very strong regional governance in our ecology groups, which we've lost a bit of. But nevertheless, from a governance perspective in Australia, we're pretty safe there. Now, speeding right along, if I can get it to move, it's frozen, that's great. Here we go. So what's this? This is actually 10 years of research, this spider web diagram. I love this thing. I got so excited the day that this all came together. But what this actually shows is the blue line is conventional farming and the orange one is regenerative farming. And what that has done is it's put a whole heap of data and practices and outcomes against the Stockholm principles. And you can see that the regenerative farmers, because of their practices, because of the way they think and their decision making, far outstrip the conventional farmers from a resilience perspective. Now, this was longitudinal. So this research started in 2016, and the last data was taken in 2020. So that actually captured the worst drought and fires in living history. And it started in a very good time. In 2016 we weren't even talking about regenerative, by the way, in Australia in 2016. We called it other things. We were certainly going pretty well, but it all went a bit pear-shaped after that. And so monitoring how people and landscapes and economics went through that period of time basically landed with this graph in the end. So it's good to keep that in mind. So I'm not saying that regenerative farmers are more profitable, I want to make this clear, than conventional farmers. I'm not going to say that, but I will say that over a period of time when you've got a couple of years of dry times or drought, what happens is the regenerative farmers, the economics of the regenerative farmers and their profitability is quite even. They have ground cover. Everything is just held, and you don't get the big ebbs and flows that we saw in the conventional farming system. So in any very good year, those conventional cattle traders, my neighbours, will outstrip me on kilos of beef with their latest ryegrass species and God knows how many tons of urea that they pile on. They will outstrip me in a very good year. But over a 4-year period, we ended up pretty much the same when it came to profitability. So that was interesting, and far less stress. So moving on. I'm going to whiz, I don't know how long I've got through now. Am I going okay, Simone, time-wise? Yep, good, got the thumb. Okay, overstepping planetary boundaries. I'm just going to divert a bit here to something a little bit new that I've been working on in the resilience space, particularly for graziers. So you've probably all seen this, you may not have, but what we're looking at here, the top one is biosphere integrity, which is your biodiversity loss. Then you've got nitrous oxide and phosphates is what's on the bottom. Now, these are things farmers have control over. And these are the sorts of things that we are now, and we've heard it in COP, that we're now getting the finger pointed at us about. So when we talk about resilience for farmers, we really need to grasp what this all means. We have to address certain issues in the farming sector. And I always like to say, even though, you know, we are a very small part of the emissions picture, but at the end of the day, we're going to save the day. Farmers always do, because farmers are the only ones, for a start, that can sequester carbon. Farmers and land managers are the only ones that can sequester carbon. So we need to keep that in mind. Okay, livestock and emissions. We all know about the methane story. We're getting hammered about it. This is not a debate on whether it's a real thing or an issue. The consumer says it is, the scientist says it is. So therefore we need to be resilient and we need to address our methane levels. So if we don't, of course, it'll be imposed on us to do so, which is fastly happening. We've seen that in New Zealand. They've got a levy in 25. Europe has already got levies on carbon dioxide emissions on any inputs, tariffs on inputs. And it's fast coming. And I did hear on the grapevine that legislation got passed in Parliament in Australia along the same lines about reducing methane emissions in the livestock sector. So basically what that says is we've got to do something about it. And of course, if we don't do things about it, then we get called out for not acting on climate mitigation. And we don't want that to happen for our agricultural sector, because plenty of big companies have been named and shamed. And there's a couple down below there that have already been named and shamed in the meat sector. And this organisation, Collier Foundation, have this thing called the FAIR Initiative, and that's the one that names and shames companies and organisations and industries. So we need to be very careful. Don't try and take this in. The whole purpose of this picture is this is all of the methane solutions that are going on now and all the research and which ones, who's doing what and where it's all at. So the bottom line of that is that there's some really clever scientists working very hard on methane mitigation, and I'm pretty confident that by next year we'll have this issue solved for the livestock sector. I can't say too much more about that, but yeah, there's some new stuff coming out which is not on this list that I believe may sort the problem naturally and not expensively. So we've heard about Asparagoptis. That hasn't been overly successful in the trials. some of these other things, yeah, they're not, we need to be mitigating methane by about 90%, not farty little amounts that cause our livestock a lot of stress and farmers more stress than they've already got. Are they effective? To date, most of them haven't been, but like I said, watch this space. Some of the stuff I'm working on next year, I think, based on early trials, will be far more effective than what has been out there to date. And it has to be cost effective for farmers and practically applicable to grazing lands. You know, it can't be just for feedlots or dairy industry. We need to be able to make sure that works on the 60% of the country that's under grazing lands. So some challenges there, but I'm confident that they will be addressed. Anyway, we all can't have one of these really funky, cool flux towers on our farms, because they're about 280,000 at last count that I heard. But that measures the methane coming off your farm. But some of the research I'm involved in with the State Decarb Hub is actually, even Wollongong University has satellites flying around up there that can actually measure the methane off from whole regions and measure the methane levels off individual farms, which is pretty exciting, because at least we then know what are we mitigating, you know, how much do we need to reduce how much methane. So that's pretty exciting stuff. What can you guys do as farmers? Well, the biggest thing you can do is get your head around sequestering carbon, because we can. And all farmers can. It's just about how fast and at what level. And whether that's through soil carbon or planting trees, you know, we need to be focused. Because if we're increasing carbon in our soil, then we're increasing our profitability. We're increasing our resilience and our ability to still be farming in the future, basically. And of course, get paid for looking after your natural capital. At last, that's actually on the cards. And, you know, next year I'll be looking at some of our new natural capital standards that will actually sit on our balance sheets. So for those farmers that are looking after their trees and their natural habitats and the quality of their water and their ground cover, will actually have that on their balance sheets as a value, that their farms are worth more because of that at long last. So focus on carbon sequestration, biodiversity, water quality, and animal health. And of course, how? Adopting regenerative ag practices. I'm like a broken record, and I apologize for that. Look, this is a bit of a head spin for a Monday, this thing. What this is a pretty funky, fun tool that I played around with for our farm. And it actually, you put in a whole heap of information, you know, what sort of fertilizers you use, how much diesel you use, how much electricity in your sheds or whatever, how many cattle you run, what are their ages, when do you turn them off, when do you purchase them. You put all of that into like an Excel spreadsheet. And these clever scientists, which is down in Melbourne University, that developed this program, it's not perfect. I just want to put that out there. There are some flaws in this, in some aspects, but the livestock accounting, I think, is pretty damn good. And it will actually tell you whether you are carbon neutral, or whether you need to offset somehow your methane levels and your carbon levels. And in our case, I'm very proud to say, because we have about 350 hectares of trees of all ages, that offsets us carrying 800 to 1,000 steers, because we've offsetted our methane through our tree cover. So that's what that, if you can see down the bottom, and I'm sorry, I don't know how big that is on yours, but our net farm emissions is a minus, which is pretty good. What does that mean for our farming enterprise? That basically means that when I sell my soil carbon credits in 2026, I don't need to use them on my farm. I can just sell them on the, however, which way I want to, either to government or corporates or whatever. So this is all about being resilient. You know, I see carbon on our farm as another enterprise, but actually as our key enterprise. and I'll talk a bit about that. But we've obviously got tourism, but we're beef traders, and we're also carbon farmers. So they're our three enterprises. And so it's really important for me to know what is my methane, or what is my emissions off our farm, and what have I got up my sleeve to be able to offset those emissions if I'm going to be a resilient farmer in the future. So I've diverted a bit there. This is what I'm trying to keep, that picture. I want our farm to stay like that and not what it looked like in 2019. But yeah, that's the aim of it. I'm not going to talk too much on this because we'll run out of time, but how do we do it? We talked about this, integrating enterprises, having a number of them. So there's my soil carbon picture, my steers that we trade, and our tourism operation. We correct our mineral deficiencies. Every paddock has different deficiencies, and every paddock gets a different recipe. That's a very expensive way to go about things, but if I spread that over 3 years, it's worth it. There's a lot of different minerals there, and I think you've got to get that soil chemistry right. If you get your chemistry right, then the microbes will come in and they'll do their part, because they're the real champions of the system. And of course, once you've got your mineral deficiencies sorted, then you go into, looking at what microbes you've got in there. Don't automatically think you just throw on a heap of compost, because in our case, when our microbiologist went and had a dig around and stuck it into the lab, he said, for God's sake, don't introduce any more microbes, because you can, I think I talked about this last week, you can end up with microbe wars. He said, just feed the little buggers, just feed them. So that's what we aim to do with basic stuff like fish emulsion and seaweed extract. Just the sort of stuff you'd put on your veggie patch at home. But I'd be putting that out to actually feed my microbes. So they'll just love that, and they'll go bananas. Talked about this a lot. You've got to have holistic grazing, time-controlled grazing, most important. That's not our paddock, by the way, on the left, but it's just a good demonstration. And you've got to use your eye and your whatever computer system you decide to use to monitor your grazing movements. We've spent a lot of money in this space. Leaky weirs, natural sequence farming, investing in wetlands. Well, we invest in our wetlands because if we're running a lot of cattle, like 800-900 head across a landscape, I don't want them compacting my spring heads. So we did some mapping with local land services of all of the spring heads on the farm, and the most important ones we need to fence off, because in a dry period, these spring heads feed many rivers from our farm. So they'll feed the Macleay, the Clarence, and the Bellinger. So I feel like I've got a responsibility to keep the quality of water flowing from the top of the range to all the little farms and villages that are down along the coast. That's more for cropping, but yeah, multi-species pasture cropping is a great way to boost carbon quite quickly if you can do that. We've talked about species diversity and the importance of it. Boy, I'm going through a lot of topics in this resilience lecture, Simone. And of course, carbon, that's what it looks like. That's some potential, this is probably another lecture, another presentation on carbon sequestration. I won't worry about that today. That's the facts and figures. But most important, what won't build resilience? And I know I do harp on this. Paddocks of bare soil with lack of ground cover is an absolute no-no at all times. Monocrops with lack of biodiversity, spraying out paddocks prior to sowing new pastures or crops, absolute no-no. Set stocking is just overstocking, and overuse of synthetic chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides. Note, we say overuse, not no use. We try to get away from synthetic chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides. It's not always, you can't always do that. There are some things we don't have a solution for. And I know I've said it before, on our farm, we have to spray our blackberries, although I choose not to along the river systems and in the gorges. I try and use a biological control down in those areas, more sensitive areas. And we have to treat our cattle for liver fluke, and that means drenching. So sometimes you just can't get away from those practices, using those synthetics. Over tillage and disturbance of the soil. There is a case sometimes for tillage, particularly in compacted soils and clay pans and so forth, but over tillage to the point of talcum powder, again, that talcum powder ends up on the New Zealand Alps. So not a good idea. And little saying, I no longer consider myself just a cattle farmer. I'm a carbon farmer that happens to use cattle to sequester carbon and reduce CO2 emissions. And I think that's it for me, because I want to allow plenty of time for questions, Simone. And I think last time we went over a bit, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. But thank you, Lorraine. Very much appreciated. And I do have the first question. Thanks, Sarah, for popping that in the chat. And we will get to this topic as well. So Lorraine's work on her farm is so entangled with carbon that she can't separate them out. But it's great. It's great if you're thinking about it already, and while you are thinking about it, Sarah's just shared, I feel lost when it comes to the carbon market. Did you engage someone, Lorraine, to assist you with understanding the offset market?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I haven't used, in my case, I didn't use an aggregator. I used consultants that were scientists. So I could get the facts that I was after. And it's still a big unknown, you know, like our farms are already at 10% carbon levels, which I believe the register told us that that's the highest they've actually got on record. And I've got to shift that. I don't know if I can shift that at all. It's a big unknown. Nobody can tell me. Only practice will tell me whether I can move that carbon from 10% upwards. I suspect I have an inkling I can, because when I measure the carbon up against the edges of the farm where the rainforest and the trees start to come in, you're looking at 26, 27%. So I think, well, okay, there's the upper limit. That's what I've got to strive for. But even 1% would be just a blast. So yeah, you know, yes, the bottom line is, yeah, you do need to use, you know, when you can't be an expert in everything. Nobody is, but just do your homework and don't sign anything without getting legal advice, quality legal advice, and talking to your accountant. I will say that. Be very careful, because it's fraught with litigation if you're not careful. And in our case, you know, we did it ourselves and we spent the money up front, and it wasn't as much as I expected to spend. And everything I'm spending, I'm also increasing productivity on the farm. So, you know, to me, it was quite warranted. I think to give you some indication, we only put 400 hectares under a soil carbon project, and that cost me 75 grand. Well, I can spend that in one fence line, and it'll buy a third of a tractor. So I thought, for the sake of the potential of a new enterprise that builds family succession on our farm, at the same time it increases productivity of the pasture, was a no-brainer for me. But yeah, I did look into getting I got good advice up early, and I also did my own homework.
Thanks, Lorraine. Bruce has just asked, what are the effects of backlines and ear tags for buffalo fly on dung beetles?
Yeah, okay. So, well, we're lucky we don't have buffalo fly, but the coast does. It's not, you've got to use there are some drenches and backliners that are more dung beetle friendly. So you really need to read the labels, and you need to ask that when you buy those products. The other thing you can do, so definitely read the label, and I won't try and pronounce which ones they are, but some are dung beetle friendly, some aren't. That goes with drenchers and backliners. The other thing you should do is you should have a quarantine paddock. So when you have to treat cattle, you put them into that quarantine paddock for minimum 3 days, I'd say 7, to get all of that crap out of their system in one spot before you spread anything around your farm. And that's the same thing for bringing cattle or bringing livestock into a farm. Have your quarantine paddocks. Most important. But I can't talk to buffalo fly. I know it's a bastard of a thing, but yeah, focus on your dung beetles. I mean, you get the system right, they'll come back. Just, you know, it's more of a holistic approach. I think you still got to look after the welfare of your livestock.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, Lorraine. It's Michael Pratt here. So when I read Principle 7 in the handout about polycentric governance, it said having multiple governing bodies allows of the sharing of knowledge across institutions. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So it talked about multiple governing bodies, but your slide talked about without relying on larger governance systems. So I'm a bit confused.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Look, my slide just gave an example. You can take multiple governing bodies is a healthy thing. A democratic system is a healthy thing. Lots of decision makers, as long as they can make the decision, rather than, I just gave an example, you know, Putin, for example, is one man making a decision, so to speak, and this is a bit extreme. It's probably not quite like that, but as against in a decision-making situation where we have in our country, you know, the parties have to agree in some on different legislation. They're voted in by the people. They go through. So there's a whole heap of protective mechanisms, and I'm only talking about in government.
Yep.
Even in decision-making on boards, it's the same principle. You know what I mean? You can't have one person that ends up controlling a massive company where lots of employees could be affected if that one person, you know, for want of a better word, had a plane crash or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So you can apply it to many scenarios. That I just gave one example.
So can I play that back to you? Sorry, can I keep on asking questions, Simone?
Oh, yeah, all good by me.
Yeah, that's fine, Michael. Go for it.
So when I sit down with my wife and discuss an issue around what do we do and when, or what winter grasses do we plant and where do we plant it, is that like multiple governing bodies? Rather than me making the decision myself?
Yes, it is. And you could take that a step further. If you were making a decision in the future, and it could be, say, let's use this as an example, whether you should, you know, go down the path of carbon farming or not. That would be a decision that if I was going to make that, I would bring in your children and all of the stakeholders involved with your farm, because that's a long-term decision, unlike the one you use, that would have ramifications for succession and the family farm down the track. So you would bring in many opinions on that because it would affect them, rather than you yourself make it entirely on your own back.
Yep. Okay. I've got more questions. Can I keep on asking?
Up to the chair, up to Simone.
Yeah, I'll just double check, Michael. You're more than welcome to keep going. I'll just double check that no one else does have any questions before we do. And thank you for kindly asking that, Michael, too. Yep, go for it. I don't see any more hands.
Okay. So I had the privilege of seeing Rachel's farm at Taree a week or so ago, and that was great, really, really lovely. During that movie, she put up some pictures of where the cattle and the methane and carbon sequestration through regenerative farming actually pulled more out than put in. I got that impression from looking at the movie, and it was some diagrams that she was talking about.
I don't think
did I get the wrong impression, or
yeah, I think well, a little bit. Well, I don't think she, if I recall, and I've watched a few times, but I don't think she went so much into the methane side of things. I think what she was talking about was in her carbon sequestration, and she was measuring she was doing the landscape verification system through the Holistic Management Cooperative, Land to Market. And what she was measuring was how much her landscape function had improved through her practices. So if her landscape function is improving through her livestock management and what they had done, that means she is sequestering more carbon. I'm not sure that Rachel has gone to the lengths yet to measure her inputs and offsets and all of that side of things as far as emissions. And I don't think that came out in the film, but the fact was her landscape function had improved immensely under the land to market verification system. And that's why she got the certificate with the big tick, and they're all excited about that. That was her improving her whole of landscape.
Okay, rightio. I don't think it was around the verification. It was little pictures and cartoons that she showed during the movie, but I may have got that wrong.
Okay. Animation stuff, yeah.
The animation stuff about the methane going up, but yet the cattle.
Yeah, okay, now I'm with you. No, that's more of the idealistic of what we're trying to achieve. That's more of what we're aiming for, okay?
Okay, understand.
Yeah, that's the bigger picture, that the little cartoon, which were quite cute little cartoon thing, that's what we're trying to do. You know, we want to be offsetting our own emissions. In fact, we want to be net zero.
Oh, thanks for your questions, Michael. They were great. Natalie does have a question too. Did you want to jump on the mic, Natalie? Oh, looks like Natalie might have frozen in that moment.
Oh. Yes, thank you. And thanks again, Lorraine. That was fantastic. Lots of questions. I apologize. Can you hear me?
Yeah, do you want to take your video off maybe, Natalie, and then
can you hear me?
Hear you a bit better.
Yeah, agree. Do you want to just turn your video off?
Can you hear me?
Natalie?
Yeah, just turn your video off.
Yeah, I'll do that. Good idea.
Oh, I think we've lost her.
Damn.
Oh, pity. And she'll probably come back on in a minute. Yeah. But if anyone else has a question in the meantime, you just need to unmute, raise your hand.
I have a question.
Great. Hey, John. Thank you.
How are you? I've been approached by a mob about carbon farming, and I didn't really have a lot of interest until they did approach me. And we've gone down the path a little bit, and they're sending papers wanting me to sign this and sign that, and I just don't feel comfortable doing that sort of thing.
Well, don't.
And I've spoken to my group, and I said, well, they want to do this, and one of our groups says, well, we're carbon farming by planting multi-species. And then I find out there's many different ways you can do carbon farming.
Yeah.
And the problem I see it for me at the moment is finding the right group that I can trust and rely on to do the right thing by me. And listening to you talking, I realize that when my project is basically operating, there's a fair chance I won't be here. So it'll be my kids that'll be left holding the chocolates, hopefully. So I'd like to talk to more people about it to try and get a clearer understanding of where to go and how to do it the right way.
And it's not something to take on lightly. I do say it's really important, John, if you are going to go down this path path to register with the ERF. I will say that, because you can't do things retrospectively, and if you do sequester carbon, you know, you're talking millions of dollars you potentially could make, and you can't then get it back in hindsight. So that's the first thing. And yeah, you just need to talk to lots of different people, but you also need to have you need to run this past your lawyer, and not all lawyers understand this space. I don't know where you're located. Where are you?
We're in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales, up above Wollongong, between Sydney and Canberra.
Yeah, okay. So I'd be happy to, you know, give you some name. I've got to be careful because I don't want to be seen to be promoting certain organisations. You know, there are some very good ones out there, but no one should be forcing you to sign contracts. You need to get all of your information. You need to run it past your entire family and everybody that is connected to that farm, because it's a 25-year caveat.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. And what you say is true. Yeah. And so it is important. But look, what can I say about this? I'm happy to say I could give you some names, I guess, down that way that might be helpful. Are you looking at soil carbon or tree carbon or? Well,
we're looking at planting trees.
Okay.
But we could go, you know, a commitment would be, if I'm going to go carbon farming and there are initiatives to do it, I can do it more than one way. Like, we don't have massive acres like you have. We're intensive agriculture. I got 300 acres, and they called and said that you're in a very high carbon sequestration area. So even if we planted 20 hectares, you would get a generous income from it.
Yeah.
So, but I'd be prepared to, I'm doing multi-species now and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
So, you know.
Look, I know when it comes to, particularly to tree carbon and stuff, I think Climate Friendly are pretty good. So maybe have a chat to them in the initial stages, but do your homework. And I mean, everyone will resonate with a different consultant, or, you know, maybe they do want an aggregator. I like to go walk the path myself with lots of different advisors and stuff and make my own mistakes. That's just my style. I'm probably a little bit more of a risk taker in that context. So it depends on what works for you, you know, and your family, and what they're comfortable with. And I think if you've got them all around the table, then I think you're going to get that back to that resilience.
Well, I will have in a few days' time.
Yeah.
All around the table.
That's right.
I don't know
it's
if
called
they'll
Christmas
enjoy it.
discussions. You'll say, right, nobody's getting their gifts from under the tree until we have this discussion about carbon. They'll love you for that.
Yeah, for sure. All good. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I also had Sarah just say she'd be interested in more info and contacts too, Lorraine, so I can have a chat about what that might look like for our RAMP participants. Natalie's back on. So I know we're at 2 o'clock if you do have to leave, but if you want to stay back, then we'll be here. And Natalie, are you able to turn your mic on with your phone?
Yes, thank you. And apologies
there we
go. Look, and thanks again, Lorraine. That's really fantastic and very helpful. Just a very quick question, and I'm sorry, I took a photo of the slide, but I haven't got it in front of me. In your research, you showed that Principle 1 and Principle 2 and how they changed over time. It was in the opposite direction of what I'd expect in terms of connectivity and biodiversity. Was I understanding it correctly? Like, it is.
They're not in any particular order, those principles.
Oh, in terms of the gap between them, between the conventional and the regen farmers.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. And what was the question?
Is that what you're expecting? I thought the gap would have been bigger for regen on the biodiversity stuff and closer on the connectivity, like the.
Look, what you can understand with that particular graph is there's a lot of different measurements going into that. if I pulled out, I've got about 60 spider web graphs, okay? So if I, I didn't want to bore the hell out of you all with all of those, but if I pulled out one of those, for instance, on biodiversity, yeah, well, the regens are going to smash it.
Yeah, yeah.
If I pulled out another one on mental health in humans, well-being, mental and physical well-being, the regens are going to smash it. And there's a whole heap of research others have done on that as well as to why that is.
Yeah.
But a lot of the reason is because of self-efficacy. So what that means is you've got, you know, you're making your own, you're working with nature and you're making decisions around working alongside rather than trying to fight it. And actually it's really good for well-being, and you feel like you don't have to be in control, that you can sort of go with the flow a bit. A whole heap of reasoning behind that. But if you look at well-being, again, there's big differences. It's the big one, and the one that's argued the most is around this issue of profitability, which is usually asking the wrong question, I will say. And that's where there's been a lot of debate and criticism. But I'm pretty confident to say over a long period of time with dramatic climate change events happening, then, like I said, what I can say is here's the regens and here's the conventionals. And I've got graphs that just show these massive ebbs and swings and ups and downs of how that's unfolding for them. And that's your boom and bust stuff. That's boom and bust. So I can confidently say that. It's very hard when you start to talk economics to compare apples and apples. And I think I've tried, from all the research that I've seen, I've done neighbour on neighbour in the same climate area with the same rainfall and the same soil type to try and get apples and apples. But even then, when you're starting to talk about economics and profitability, trying to compare apples and apples, you know, you're always relying on, you know, how good is the data that they're giving you. And then you've got to test their data, and you're asking personal questions around, you know, how much equity you got in the farm and all these sorts of things. Whereas environmentally, I can go out and I can test the soil and I can know exact. So, but like I said, that's a summary of the whole lot. If I pull out social, environmental, and economic, you're going to see massive big. In fact, environmentally, the conventionals, if I recall on my spider graph, they were so low on the biodiversity aspect that it didn't even make a mark on the spider graph, and the regens were way around the peripheral, and it was embarrassing. So we actually had to bump it up a little bit so you could actually see the little blue circle for the conventionals. That's how dramatic the biodiversity differences were.
Right, thank you.
Okay, and we just had a couple of questions in the chat from Michael. Is it possible to send the link for the Vic Uni spreadsheet?
Probably. I'm just thinking through that. Yes, I think actually, if you go on, if anyone wants to play with that, I'm pretty sure you'll find it. MLA simplified it and put out a simplified version. I don't know why they simplified it. I didn't think it was difficult to put the data in, but maybe they just think we're all a bit dumb. I don't know. But anyway, there is a simplified version. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure it's a free-for-all. You could Google it and just grab the methane calculator or the emissions calculator.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And then you can play with it yourself. It's free. It's great fun. It'll either scare the hell out of you, or it'll make you feel really good for the fact that you got lots of vegetation cover and you've got it covered.
Brilliant. And just had one more from Petri. What happens when a fire takes out all your trees?
Well, what happens? Well, it doesn't quite work like a fire doesn't normally take out all the trees. What we had to be really careful of up at Ebor is that certain species don't like a fire that's too hot. So the eucalypts love fires. They don't like them when they're real hot. And that particular fire that I showed you was a very hot fire. Banksias don't like fires at all, and because they keeled over. So we lost certain species, that's for sure. The eucalypts have started to bounce back, but normally how you get things like, and I'm sure you're all aware of New England dieback, it's not a one event that causes that. It's a series of events on the back of each other. So if you, for instance, have a fire that comes through and then the trees that look to be dead, then the new little green shoots, we've all seen that, little green shoots coming up the tree trunks. What that can do is attract massive insect plagues that will then come in and hammer those green shoots. So the tree's tried to regenerate itself, but insects have gone, oh, good, look at all the fodder on those trees. They've come in and they've smashed it. Now, the tree can handle a little bit of that as long as rain follows. If we had got not the big floods of 2020 and we'd had yet another drought on the back of that, 2 years of that and the trees would have said, too hard, we're done. Okay, so it's not, trees will recover if they're given the opportunity to recover. But if you get a back-to-back-to-back event that keeps playing with their survival skills, then of course you're going to lose species. And that's how we've ended. New England tablelands didn't always look like New England tablelands in some areas look now. And the dieback that we see there was because of overclearing, overuse of superphosphate on the back of a drought, new shoots being smashed by beetles, and then trees dying, now bare paddock. So it's a chain of events that will cause that, a bit like the fish kills in the Murray-Darling. It's, you know, Barnaby said it was just about drought. Well, Barnaby, it wasn't just about drought. It was also because of the way the river was being managed, the fertilizers that were flowing into the system and causing the blue-green algae, and a whole heap of other events combined to kill those fish. So I don't know if that answers the question about the trees.
I'll find out enough Petrus, but you can open your mic if you want, Petrus. No. I'll take that as a yes. But I think that's it from everyone. But thank you, and thanks for hanging around as well. Always a pleasure to hear from you, Lorraine. Love your passion and your knowledge. And
apologies to put you through all the stress about trying to make this happen today when my computer crashed. 1,000 apologies.
Oh, completely fine. Not a problem at all. Thanks to those who can join us live today as well. It's great to have your questions and your input to make it more interactive. This is our last guest lecture for 2023. So enjoy the festive season, enjoy your family, and enjoy your farming as you do. And I look forward to catching up with you in the new year. I'll send out the new calendar invites for our next presentations. Thank you so much, everyone.
See you guys. Thanks, Simone.
Pleasure. Thanks, Lorraine.